The day I found out a kid fresh out of college made 50% more than me, I was sitting across from a desk I'd practically paid for with my spine and my sleep. I remember staring at the edge of Brandon's leather chair and thinking it probably cost more than my car's last major repair. My hands were resting on a printout of my salary adjustment request, but it felt less like a request and more like a test of how stupid they thought I was. Brandon leaned back, steepling his fingers like he'd learned it from some leadership podcast, and started explaining that the market had changed. He told me newer hires brought in fresh skills, that they'd been trained on the latest frameworks, that guys like me had grown up on legacy systems. He didn't say I was obsolete, but he didn't have to. The word was floating there between us, sitting on top of the manila folder like a stain. I didn't interrupt him. I just let him talk. In my head, I was replaying the last 7 years of my life like a glitchy security camera feed. The first time I diagrammed our network architecture on a whiteboard that still smelled like new paint. The nights I slept on the office couch while our first big client system kept crashing. The morning I got a text that my son's baseball team had taken the championship and I was in a server room, elbow deep in a failing RAID array. When he finally paused, I told him I'd seen the numbers, that an email had been forwarded to me by mistake, and I'd noticed a fresh grad we'd just hired starting at a salary I'd never even been offered. I didn't shout. My voice came out quieter than I expected, the kind of quiet you get when something inside you has already broken and you're just picking up the pieces. I reminded him that the legacy system he kept talking about was the backbone of his father's company, that I was the one who laid out the subnets, wrote the documentation, tuned the database clusters when we were too broke to afford a consultant. He nodded like he understood, then told me again that this wasn't personal. According to him, my pay reflected the market when I was hired, and new hires had to be brought in at current rates to stay competitive. It wasn't the explanation that hurt. It was the assumption behind it, that I'd hear all of that, swallow my pride, and keep showing up like nothing happened. By the time I left his office, my head was pounding. I walked past the open-plan rows of desks, past the wall where they'd hung framed photos from the early days. Grainy shots of pizza boxes, white boards full of scribbles, a younger version of me standing next to Charles Walsh with a marker in my hand and dark hair that hadn't yet started going gray at the temples. Back then, when he clapped me on the shoulder and told me we were building something together, I believed him. In the parking lot, I sat in my Honda with the engine off and the heat slowly fading out of the vents. I pulled my wallet out, not because I needed anything from it, but because there was a folded piece of paper behind my driver's license. Our mortgage statement. I'd stuffed it there a week earlier after Maria and I had gone over the numbers at the kitchen table. $2,800 a month for a modest 3-bedroom in Thornton, 2 kids thinking about college, a wife working part-time at a school. Looking at that statement, Brandon's words clicked into place in a way he hadn't intended. Guys like me didn't quit. Guys like me had braces to pay for and car insurance for teenagers and an aging water heater that could die any month now. Guys like me stayed put, took the 2% raises, and told ourselves it would get better next year. I drove home in a kind of automated fog. The highway blurred past, and my mind drifted back to a different memory. Charles standing in front of all 12 of us in that first cramped office, telling us there might be a rough month or two when we couldn't make full payroll. He'd asked who could handle a temporary cut while he secured funding. I'd raised my hand, along with most of the team. Back then it felt like we were all taking the risk together. That night, I spread the mortgage statement, the college fund summaries, and my latest pay stub out on the kitchen table. Maria had already gone to bed after her shift. The kids were in their rooms, and the only sound in the house was the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional passing car outside. My hands were flat on the table, and my eyes kept drifting to one line: available college savings. It wasn't even enough for a year at a state school, not when you added housing and everything else. Then my mind jumped to the email I wasn't supposed to see. 3 months earlier, I'd been doing routine cleanup on one of our file servers. Just the usual maintenance, deleting temp files, archiving old logs, shuffling folders that had grown out of control. There was a directory with a bland name, something like executive_strategy_Q3, sitting where it didn't belong. I almost deleted it. Instead, I opened it to make sure it didn't contain anything important. Inside was a thread of emails between Charles, Brandon, and our HR director at the time. I didn't intend to read the whole thing, but my own name caught my eye in the preview line, and curiosity did the rest. It was one of those threads that started polite and got uglier as you scrolled. There was talk of tenure cost management, of leveraging emotional investment versus cash incentives. At one point, Brandon flat out said I was unlikely to leave because of my family and mortgage, so there was no strategic justification for promoting me or adjusting my pay to current market levels. I remember staring at that sentence, about my kids, my house, my so-called sunk cost, as the fans in the server rack whirred around me. In that moment, the whole picture shifted. Loyalty wasn't something they rewarded. It was something they weaponized. I should have taken a screenshot and sent it to myself. But the admin in me, the rule follower who'd signed every security policy, shut that impulse down. I closed the folder, moved it to the proper restricted directory, and told myself I'd imagine the worst of it. That maybe there was context I was missing. That maybe Charles still meant everything he'd said in those late-night planning sessions when we shared cheap pizza and big dreams. Then came the accidentally forwarded compensation breakdown. A week before my meeting with Brandon, an email meant for HR and upper management landed in my inbox. It contained a neat little table of salaries for our latest hiring cohort. I saw the number next to a name I'd helped interview, a kid who'd stumbled through basic questions about subnets and routing but had a shiny resume and a top-tier university on his side. My own salary sat in my head like an older version of that number, stuck in time, never allowed to grow up. So when Brandon started talking about fresh perspectives and market conditions, I wasn't hearing a neutral explanation. I was hearing the echo of that earlier email chain, the one that treated my life as a line item in a spreadsheet. Sitting at the kitchen table, I took a pen and started scribbling numbers in the margins of our mortgage statement. What would it look like if my pay had kept up with the market even modestly? How much had I effectively donated back to the company in the form of underpaid labor? At what point did loyalty stop being a value and start being self-harm? My phone buzzed. It was a message from my son, Carlos, from down the hall. He'd sent me a link to an engineering program at a university he liked, along with a comment about how cool their labs looked. A minute later, my daughter, Sophia, sent me a meme about coding bugs and late-night ramen. 2 conversations, 2 separate threads, both orbiting around the world. I'd spent my life in tech, networks, systems. I stared at both messages and felt something heavy shift inside my chest. If I kept swallowing this, what was I teaching them? That you put your head down and let people tell you your worth? That we're like family can excuse anything? I thought about my father, who worked 30 years at the same manufacturing plant until one day management announced a restructuring and his pension evaporated in a cloud of legal jargon. I thought about my older brother, who broke his back on construction sites only to be replaced by cheaper labor once he hit his 40s. In my family, loyalty had always been sold as a virtue. In practice, it had become a convenient way for other people to save money. A part of me wanted to print that old email thread, march into Charles's office and slap it on his desk. Another part wanted to just quietly polish my resume, leverage my experience, and jump ship for a company that didn't think tenure was a synonym for discount. That second part was louder, at least at first. I had responsibilities now, not the freedom of a 25-year-old with a backpack and no dependents. But the more I looked at those papers on the table, the more that quieter part, the one that had spent years designing secure systems and tracing subtle patterns in log files, started connecting dots. If they did this to me, they were doing it to everyone like me. Anyone who'd stayed longer than 2 or 3 years. Anyone who'd believed the "we're in this together" speeches. That thought made my hands curl into fists on the tabletop. It wasn't just about my mortgage anymore. It was about the support specialist downstairs who'd been here 6 years and never once complained about staying late. About the senior database admin who missed more family dinners than she could count. About a whole swarm of people who'd built this place while being paid like they were lucky to be included. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The fan blades spun slowly, casting moving shadows across the room. In that moment, something clicked in my head the same way it does when you finally isolate the cause of a persistent network bug. The problem wasn't just a bad configuration or a one-off miscommunication. It was a design choice, a strategy, and I realized I had access to the one thing that could expose it. For 7 years, I'd held admin-level keys to the Kingdom system logs, payroll databases, permission structures, archived email servers. I knew where everything lived, not because I wanted power, but because it was my job to keep the machine running. They trusted me with their infrastructure. They just never considered what would happen if I stopped mistaking trust for respect. I didn't make a plan that night, not a full one, but as I gathered up the mortgage statement and the college fund printouts, one thought settled in and refused to leave. If I walked away without saying anything, the next Vincent would walk in and sit down at the same underpaid desk. And the people pulling the strings would keep congratulating themselves on how loyal their workforce was. I turned off the kitchen light and headed down the hallway. Carlos's door was half open, a glow from his laptop spilling into the dark. Sophia's room was littered with sticky notes and sketches of app ideas. I paused there for a second, listening to the quiet of a house full of sleeping dreams, and felt that heavy thing inside me harden into something sharper. They thought my family made me easier to control. They were about to find out they'd miscalculated. I woke up before dawn on Sunday with the kind of restless clarity that usually hits me only during major outages. Those nights when a client's entire system is down and every second feels like a countdown to disaster. But this time, the system I was about to dissect wasn't on a rack or behind a firewall. It was the company I'd spent 7 years helping to build, and the disaster had already happened. I just hadn't admitted it yet. The house was quiet. Maria was still asleep. The kids wouldn't be up for hours. I padded down the hallway, poured myself a cup of cold coffee from last night's pot, and sat at my home office desk. The cursor blinked on my monitor, steady and patient. Felt like an invitation. If they wanted to underpay their people, that was one kind of problem. But if they were running a quiet strategy of exploiting loyalty and trapping long-term employees under outdated salary bands, that was another thing entirely. And I had the keys to prove it. I logged into the company's remote administrative console through a secure connection, the same one I used when the on-call rotation needed support at 2 a.m. My access wasn't special or illicit. It was the same access I'd held for years, granted because someone had to manage the logs and permissions and backups, and that someone was usually me. The first place I looked was the payroll reporting database. Not the HR portal employees saw, but the back-end structure that stored historical data, performance ratings, and salary bands. It wasn't locked to me. That was their first mistake. I remember staring at the schema, tables of compensation histories, performance review metadata, hiring cohorts, market benchmarks. Most developers wouldn't know where to start. But I'd designed half of this system. I knew which columns mattered and which ones were noise. So I started writing queries. Simple ones at first. Salary by hire date. Salary by department. Salary growth over time. Then I layered them. Salary growth over time compared to market benchmarks I knew HR used for job leveling. Salary inconsistencies filtered by tenure. Median salaries for employees under 2 years versus over 5. The patterns didn't just emerge. They screamed. Employees who had stayed longer than 3 years were, on average, more than 40% below market rates. New hires? They were brought in at or above the market baseline. The longer you stayed, the more the company saved. I felt something cold trace down my spine. This wasn't a glitch or an accident. It was a system, a strategy. Maybe not written officially in any handbook, but embedded in the decisions, in the budgets, in the consistency of the discrepancies. By the time I finished the first pass of the analysis, the sun was rising in a thin streak of orange through the blinds. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of realizing just how big this was. I printed out the most important data points and laid them across the carpet in neat rows. Names I recognized stared back at me. People I'd mentored. People who'd pulled all-nighters with me during critical deployments. People who'd stayed because they believed the company valued loyalty. Jennifer, our senior database admin, making barely over $50,000 despite 6 years of service. Kevin in network security, 5 years in, but paid like a junior. Meanwhile, the new hires under them, the ones they trained, made tens of thousands more. It wasn't just me. It was everyone like me. I needed advice. Real advice. Not the kind you get from someone who tells you to keep your head down. So I called Daniel. We'd served together in the Air Force more than 20 years earlier. He'd been the guy who always kept a cool head when everyone else was panicking. After leaving the service, he'd gone into employment law. Not corporate, not management, employee rights, whistleblower protections. The kind of thing you don't think you need until you suddenly do. He picked up on the second ring. Vince? You never call before noon on a Sunday. Something wrong? Yeah, I said. Something's very wrong. I told him everything: Brandon's meeting, the forwarded compensation breakdown, the old email thread I'd found during server maintenance, the queries I'd run that morning. I didn't sugarcoat any of it because there was no point. When I finished speaking, he let out a low whistle. This is systematic, he said. Not sloppy, not accidental. They're leveraging loyalty as a cost-saving measure. Classic wage compression strategy. I asked him what my options were. He paused before answering. I could hear him shifting in his chair. Vincent, listen carefully. Accessing the data isn't the issue. You had legitimate admin privileges. The line only gets blurry when you start distributing it. If you go public, you need to be precise, controlled, and prepared. Prepared for what? I asked. Retaliation, legal threats, your entire industry whispering that you're difficult. It's a big risk. What if I don't do anything? Then nothing changes, he said simply. Not for you. Not for anyone there. I closed my eyes. He sighed. You're not the type to look the other way. Just be smart. Be deliberate. I thanked him and hung up. For the next 12 hours, I worked like a man possessed. I reorganized the data, cross-referenced performance reviews with compensation histories, highlighted disparities so egregious they almost looked fake. I redacted personal identifiers, labels, and metadata. I crafted charts that made the disparities unmistakable. Then I wrote a report that was part technical breakdown, part ethical indictment. The kind of thing nobody could shrug off once they saw it. By the time I finished, it was nearly midnight and my head was throbbing. But I wasn't done. On the far corner of my desk sat a stack of blank envelopes. I took one and wrote a single word across the front. Brandon. Inside, I placed 3 things. My resignation letter, effective immediately. A printed excerpt of the email thread describing the wage suppression strategy. A USB drive containing the most sanitized version of my compensation analysis. No personal data, just undeniable patterns. I sealed the envelope and pressed the flap down with my thumb until it stuck. For a long moment, I just sat there and looked at it. That envelope represented the last 7 years of my life, and the line between who I had been and who I was about to become. At 4:30 Monday morning, I woke up, showered, shaved, and put on the best shirt I owned. The one Maria bought me for interviews just in case. I stood in the mirror and studied the face looking back at me. Older, sharper, more tired, but steadier. It's time, I told myself out loud. The drive to the office felt like moving through the quiet before a storm. Streetlights flickered across the windshield. Denver was still asleep. When I badged into the building at 5:15 a.m., the night security guard gave me a curious look. Early start, he asked. Big day, I said, and for the first time in months, the smile on my face didn't feel forced. I walked straight to the 5th floor. Brandon's office was dark, the skyline behind his glass wall just beginning to catch the first light of morning. I stepped inside and placed the manila envelope on his chair. Not the desk, where an assistant or cleaning crew might find it. The chair, where only he would sit. Then I went to my workstation in the server room. The hum of the machines sounded different that morning, like they knew something I didn't. I opened my laptop, pulled up the email draft I'd prepared the night before, and read it one last time. 34 employees, all of them with more than 2 years at the company. All of them underpaid. All of them out of excuses for why. My finger hovered over the send button. I thought of Maria, of the kids, of the years I'd spent believing the speeches about family. I thought of every person downstairs who showed up early, stayed late, and trusted the wrong people for too long. This isn't revenge, I told myself. This is truth. And I pressed send. The moment the email left my outbox, the world felt sharper, louder, more real. I closed my laptop, powered down my workstation, and took one slow walk through the office. The office I had helped wire, configure, and keep alive. Every room held a memory. At 6:45, I walked out to the parking lot, got into my car, and waited. At exactly 7:07 a.m., my phone lit up. It was Brandon. I let it ring, then ring again. When he texted, the words were frantic enough that I could almost hear them shaking. "What the hell is this? Call me now." I stared at the message, flipped my phone face down on the passenger seat, and took a deep breath. The storm had begun. By the time the second wave of messages hit my phone, the parking lot had filled with the early shift. I watched familiar silhouettes pass through the glass doors. People carrying coffee, backpacks, half-awake expressions, completely unaware that their morning was about to explode. At 7:15, Jennifer sent me a message. "Vince, is this email real?" Right after that came another from Kevin. I knew something was off. "Thank you." And then a flood. Some confused, some furious, some stunned into silence. I didn't respond to any of them. I just sat there, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel, feeling the weight of what I'd set in motion settle across my shoulders. Then at 7:30, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. I already knew who it was. I answered. Before I could say a word, I heard the ragged fury in Brandon's voice as he snapped, "You have 30 seconds to explain yourself before I have you arrested for corporate espionage." I kept my tone calm, almost clinical, like I was explaining a basic network protocol to someone who'd never touched a router. I told him I hadn't accessed anything outside the scope of my legitimate administrator privileges. I told him Colorado protected wage transparency. And then I told him something that finally shut him up. "If you want to talk about legal consequences, I'd be more than happy to bring the Colorado Department of Labor into the discussion." He hesitated. I could hear him swallow. "What do you want, Vincent?" "Meet me," I said. "Starbucks on 16th. 90 minutes. Bring someone from legal if it makes you feel safe. But come alone. You're insane if you think." I cut him off. "Brandon, you have 34 employees reading that email right now. If you think this can't get worse, you're out of your depth." Silence. Then, "Fine. We'll meet." I hung up before he could add anything else. The Starbucks was already busy when I arrived at 9:15. I chose a table in the corner with a clear view of the entrance and kept my back to the wall, old military habit. My pulse was steady, surprisingly steady, considering I'd just thrown an entire company into chaos before most people had eaten breakfast. At 9:30 sharp, Brandon walked in. He looked nothing like the smug VP who'd lectured me about market realities 2 days earlier. His hair was uncombed, his face flushed, and he carried himself like a man who'd been up all night mainlining fear and caffeine. Patricia, the HR director, was right behind him. And next to her, a man in a navy suit I didn't recognize. Definitely the company's lawyer. They spotted me immediately. Brandon marched over, slammed his folder on the table, and hissed through clenched teeth, "You've completely lost your mind." I didn't flinch. "What you're experiencing," I said, "is clarity." Patricia leaned forward, her expression hard and professional. "You distributed proprietary compensation data. That's a serious breach." "Actually," I interrupted, "what I distributed were general findings derived from company systems I'm authorized to manage, and nothing I sent identified any individual by name. Meanwhile, your internal strategy of suppressing wages based on tenure? That's something the state might be very interested in." The lawyer spoke up next, trying to sound measured. "Mr. Rodriguez, we can resolve this calmly. But you must understand, you've put yourself in a legally precarious." I slid a folder across the table. He opened it. His eyes widened. Inside was my proposed solution. Adjust salaries for all underpaid long-term employees to current market rates. Provide retroactive compensation for the worst cases. Implement transparent compensation bands. Issue a formal correction acknowledging internal inequities. You want to bankrupt us? Patricia snapped. I shook my head. I ran the numbers myself. You can afford it with last quarter's profit. You'll just have to cut executive bonuses for 2 cycles. Brandon bristled. We're not doing this. I leaned in, my voice low and steady. Then tomorrow morning, your largest client will receive a packet explaining exactly how you've been manipulating compensation. So will your investors. So will the Labor Department. Brandon's face drained of color. The lawyer whispered urgently to him. Finally, he exhaled shakily. We need time to review this. You have until Thursday, 5 p.m. After that, the documents go out. I stood, pushed my chair in, and added, and Brandon, this time, it is personal. Then I walked out. I was halfway home when my phone started buzzing again. The first message came from Jennifer. Emergency all hands at 11. Brandon looks like he's about to pass out. Then Kevin. He's panicking. HR's scrambling. I didn't go to the meeting, but I heard about it in real time. Through texts, screenshots, whispered summaries. Brandon stood in front of the entire company, pale and sweating, and delivered a speech packed with corporate euphemisms. Something about recently identified discrepancies, ongoing compensation review, and internal equity realignment. A fancy way of saying we got caught. By noon, my email was filled with messages from coworkers. Some were angry, rightfully angry. Some were relieved. Some were scared. A few said things like, you did what we all wish we had the guts to do. At 2 p.m., an email arrived from the company's legal department. A separation agreement. 6 months of pay. Full benefits for 90 days. Expunged HR file. In return, I had to sign a strict NDA and surrender all remaining copies of my analysis. I forwarded it to Daniel. He called me instantly. They're terrified, he said. 6 months severance for someone they claim committed data misuse? That's hush money. Should I take it? I asked. That depends. Do you want this to be over? Or do you want to finish what you started? For a long moment, I didn't answer. I thought of the employees still inside that building. The ones who didn't have admin access. The ones who'd never stumble across that email thread. The ones who trusted leadership to do right by them. Finally, I said, I'm not done. Daniel exhaled sharply. Then decline the offer. And hold the line. I typed my response. No, thank you. Then hit send. The next morning, 4 people resigned. By Wednesday afternoon, 11. All long-term employees. And that was before the company had even released their adjustment plan. Every new resignation made the leadership team more desperate, more frantic, more cornered. At 4:47 p.m. on Thursday, 13 minutes before my deadline, my phone rang again. This time it was a number I hadn't seen in years. I answered. Vincent. A familiar voice said quietly, Can we talk? I hadn't heard Charles Walsh sound that tired since the early startup days when he was running on ramen and desperation. What do you want to talk about? I asked. I want to implement your plan, he said. All of it. I was silent. He continued, voice cracking just slightly. My son is reckless. I should have stepped in sooner. You deserved better. And so did everyone else. And Brandon. Taking an extended leave, Charles said. Indefinite. I closed my eyes and let the moment sink in. He added, almost pleading, just tell me what needs to happen next. For the first time in a long time, I felt the balance finally shift. Away from them toward the people who built the place. I told him I'd send over the full implementation guidelines. He thanked me, and for the first time in years it actually sounded sincere. 2 weeks after Charles called me, the company finally released the official compensation adjustments. It didn't come as a flashy announcement or some victory speech. It came quietly, like a taped-up cardboard box left outside every employee's digital doorstep. But the impact, it was seismic. Jennifer's salary jumped from barely 52 to almost 80. Kevin's went from low 60s to nearly 90. Others, people who had held this company together with spit, sweat, and hope, finally saw numbers that reflected the skill they'd earned, not the loyalty that had been used against them. Retroactive pay landed in their accounts within days. Some cried. Some celebrated. Some wrote me long emails they never intended to send but needed to write. But even with everything corrected on paper, the damage was already done. Because once someone realizes they've been undervalued for years, no paycheck can rebuild that trust. By the end of the month, TechCore had lost 18 long-term employees. Half its core experience base evaporated into the Denver tech ecosystem like mist under sunlight. Every recruiter in town suddenly had an easy pitch. You deserve better. We'll prove it. Meanwhile, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Some companies tiptoed around me, worried I was a problem. Others treated me like the exact kind of person they wanted leading their technical teams. Principled, thorough, and unafraid to burn down a rotten structure. 3 weeks after resigning, I accepted a job at Pinnacle Solutions, a cybersecurity firm that actually practiced transparency instead of bragging about it in all-hands meetings. The salary? $94,000. More than 60% higher than what TechCore had paid me. Benefits included tuition support for dependents. When I told Maria, she threw her arms around me and whispered, "Finally!" 6 months later, something happened that I didn't expect. I started receiving emails from strangers, HR managers in Phoenix, engineers in Dallas, team leads in Chicago. One message read, "We heard a story about a senior engineer in Denver who refused to stay underpaid. That story reached our executive meeting. We ran an audit. We corrected 3 salary bands. Thank you." Another came from a small tech firm. "You don't know me, but your situation pushed us to reevaluate how we treat employees over 5 years. Changes are coming." And then another and another. It was like a ripple spreading across the industry. I wasn't trying to be some crusader. I was just a guy who'd had enough. But somehow, the impact didn't stop at the office I left. It reached people I'd never meet. A year after leaving TechCore, I stood behind a podium at the Rocky Mountain Technology Association conference. The stage lights were bright enough to blur the first few rows, but I could see the mixture of managers, engineers, and executives filling the room. The topic they'd invited me to speak on? Fair compensation practices in modern tech organizations. I never thought I'd be talking about wage transparency to a crowd of CTOs. But there I was, steadying my breathing as I began. "I'm not here to tell anyone to blow up their career," I said. "I'm here to talk about value, how we measure it, how we ignore it, and how easily we let companies convince us our loyalty should come at a discount." The room was silent in a way that told me they were listening. During Q&A, a young woman in the 3rd row raised her hand. Her voice was soft but certain when she asked, "How did you find the courage to risk everything?" I thought for a moment before answering. "It wasn't courage," I said. "It was exhaustion. When staying quiet hurts more than speaking up, that's when everything changes." After the talk, she approached me. She worked for a well-known tech company in Denver. She and several coworkers had noticed troubling patterns in their pay structure. Senior employees lagging behind new hires, promotions constantly deferred. "We want to do something," she said, "but we're scared." I handed her Daniel's card. "Don't start loud," I told her. "Start smart." 6 months later, her company launched a compensation transparency initiative. No drama, no lawsuits, just quiet, necessary change. Life at home changed, too. Carlos got accepted into the computer engineering program at Colorado School of Mines, his dream school. Sophia decided she wanted to pursue cybersecurity, which made me laugh because, of course, she did. Maria and I refinanced the house. The constant financial anxiety that used to sit like a stone in my chest finally loosened. Sometimes, on my way home from work, I stop at a cafe near my new office. One afternoon, I spotted Jennifer and Kevin at a corner table. Both looked happier, more alive, new company badges hanging from their laptops. They waved me over and we talked for an hour about new projects, better pay, bosses who actually listened. Before I left, Jennifer said something that stuck with me. "Your email didn't just expose the company. It reminded all of us that we weren't crazy, that we deserved fairness." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. A few weeks later, I walked through the server room at my new job. The towers hummed, lights blinking steadily in their racks. It reminded me of the thousands of hours I'd spent keeping machines alive while leadership treated me like an afterthought. But in this room, at this company, the air felt different. Respect wasn't assumed, it was practiced. I rested my hand on one of the server doors and let out a slow breath. I didn't change the industry, I whispered to myself, but maybe I helped change something. And sometimes, something is enough, because the most powerful tool any of us have isn't root access or admin privileges. It's the ability to say, I deserve better, and mean it,